Okay, good afternoon. Uh, this is the third webinar from EDB. So I would like to welcome all the participants who registered for this session. And the session today has a kind of a bit of a lengthy topic. The world has changed. Have we? Is Sri Lanka missing the opportunities in a post-COVID world? And agripreneurs' perspective. So to present this, we have a well-known personality, Mr. Mario De Alvis. He's the founder, managing director of Mars Kitchen, that is Sri Lanka's favorite family meal solutions provider. Founder, member, and past chairman of the National Agribusiness Council. Also the founder, member, and past president of the Sri Lanka Food Processors Association. So we have Mr. Mario De Alvis with us. And I would like to remind you, just as in our earlier webinars, you are invited to share your thoughts. And also at the end of the webinar, we invite you to take part in our question and answer session so that you can further explore any concerns, achievements of this subject. Also, I would like to briefly remind you regarding the discussion points that we have put forward. Discussion points would be on the pre- and post-pandemic environment, a nation's assets and optimizing their use, also the wisely culturing a sustainable and comparative destination brand. So those we have formulated as discussion points. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Mario De Alvis to take us through this topic in this webinar. Mario, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you to the EDB for inviting me to present this case. And thank you everybody for joining. So our topic is the world has changed, have we? I keep asking myself this question as and when I have to negotiate all the ins and outs of what is happening around us right now. Because I have the feeling that the pandemic, though it creates so much of havoc, it also creates an opportunity for a country like Sri Lanka. So I'd like to take this topic by breaking it into three. Let's first look at the pre and post environment. Then let's look at the assets we as a nation carry and see how we can culture a sustainable destination brand. Now, when I say culture, I mean it because I truly believe that a destination brand is a culture in itself. If we as stakeholders do not live and thrive by it, then I think it is a meaningless exercise. So ladies and gentlemen, the world just changed one morning. You see, there was a fully functional world, and then we heard about the COVID starting up in Wuhan in China, and then everybody expected, as it had been previously with SARS, Ebola, AIDS, that there would be a certain amount of people who will be affected by it, but it will pass us by and the world will continue to go on as it was. But this time, it reached the world so fast that, the world did not know what happened. And basically everybody just panicked. You see, like the building in the night where people are knocking off lights, the world started shutting down. I think sometimes looking back in history, we may also see that, it was sheer panic and knee-jerk that made this situation. One day there was a fully functional world, and next day everything was closed. In 2018, 40,000 aircrafts carried over 4 billion people around the world. And just in a couple of months, 90% of this fleet was grounded and borders closed. Never before had we heard about anything like this. If you take Asia, around 200 million people visited Asia alone. Based on these visitors, there had been food chains that had been created. From the small street vendor to the star class restaurants, there was an export market where each of the countries in Asia shared their culinary wealth. And it will probably take years before we build back this supply chain. In Asia, we had quite a lot of successful poverty alleviation programs running. Just imagine the damage that this has done, because as we all know, agriculture was the base from which these vulnerable communities thrived on. And now we have a situation where the sons and daughters who had migrated into urban areas to work in the industry, some of them had migrated abroad to work as migrant workers in the Middle East, in Korea. They have started coming back home. Some of them may never return to their job. So they would be back here in our rural areas. And as Sri Lankans, we all have the challenge of how we are going to connect this supply chain to the world markets and to our urban cities. Because as we saw during the shutdown, there was a huge amount of waste, which was very unfortunate due to the unplanned situation. And we should be avoiding, because how do we know? We never know if we'll get hit by such a situation again. Let's now look back at history, a little bit of Sri Lanka's history and the country's watershed moments, which we had gone through. Some created opportunities like this, which we never held to, and the rest of us have taken us to where we are today. Many centuries back, we were largely a nation who lived in harmony with our environment. We had intelligent rulers who harvested rain, cared for the nation's health and nourishment, like our 4th century AD, 4th century king Dhatusena, who was an Ayurvedic practitioner and who also opened hospitals and spoke about wellness foods. We were generally a peace-loving country. And then we face the coming of the colonials. We had many years of this, and finally, we managed to achieve independence. After independence, we had a few problems cropping up. We had the ethnic disharmony, and we also had growing disparity because of land ownership and things like that. There came a time when the urban ruling class were rebelled against by the rural youth. So we then had land reforms. We saw industry, fledgling industries start up in Sri Lanka. We had joint ventures such as the Noritake, Lanka Volatiles, which up to date are very strong companies and are doing quality products for the world market. We then became South Asia's first free market. We saw the accelerated Mahaweli project, which increased our agriculture production. And as we went by, our farmers started forgetting their sustainable ways and started use of chemicals in their agriculture. More and more it went. Once again, with the free market, disparities started growing. There was a second youth uprising and the ethnic conflict hit us for 30 years. During that time, we were also ravaged by the Asian or the Indian Ocean tsunami. And then finally, the 3-decade war came to an end. Once again, a great opportunity for us to move forward. We were then hit by the Easter bombings of 2019. So if we look back, ladies and gentlemen, what can we say or what can we think about ourselves? I myself feel that we Sri Lankans, though imperfect, we are a resilient nation. Each time we had been faced by a calamity, we got up, we faced it, and we moved on. We had been offered many opportunities in the past. But for some reason, we have this sufficient culture where we are happy with our lot, and we may have passed by without actually grabbing at these opportunities. If we had, we probably would have been up there with some of the best performing nations in Asia. Now, I think the time has come for us to ask ourselves, each one of us, are we ready to face a very different era? This is not like it was before. And if we do not understand that this is a different era, we would continue to lavish at the bottom of the barrel, as you may say. So let's fast forward to the post-pandemic era. So this time it was unlike some of those things that we have faced before. The whole world got affected by this pandemic. It was not Sri Lanka, it was not Asia, it was not South Asia alone, but the whole wide world. Even the most powerful and developed countries are facing a crisis at this moment of time. The biggest loser in all of this was confidence. I think humankind had this feeling that we were an invincible race, that we had answers for most things. We could just continue to live as we were, and then as things came along, we would find the answers. I think when the pandemic first started off, or when it was in its startup stages in China, we had all of us had the same feeling that it's going to pass us by. Somebody is going to come up with a solution, but that has not happened. Let's look at the agribusiness angle of all of this. So we have the situation where people are now going back into the rural areas. And they are obviously going to adopt into their traditional form of income and sustenance, and that's agriculture. So production will take place. There are problems taking place. There may be fertilizer shortages. There may be problems in the distribution and things like that. And in certain cases, there are huge drops of the price, transport issues coming up. But people will continue to produce because that is what they know. And every time we have been in crisis, that is what they have done. And they have managed to get to the next day. The importance of the food supply chain was felt by everybody, those in the rural areas and those in the urban areas. I think we need to be happy in this country that, okay, it did go down right at the beginning, but very quickly we adapted. We had our food supply chains coming in different modes, but ultimately arriving in our homes. And we had, as time went by, we had a wider and wider choice. We still have a challenge of minimizing waste and finding ways and means of bridging the gap between the two seasons. Because as we now leave the Maha harvest, there is a season where the prices will go up and there is a bit of a lull in cultivation. During this time, we need to process. And that's when the food processing companies have a very important part to play. So deurbanization will also take place. Just before the pandemic, we were talking about the increase of business and, for instance, the port city. The port city project was, at that time, supposed to bring in almost 9 million people for a year, including the other tourism-related visitors, which would have been targeting around 3 to 4 million people. Now, it's very important that we realize that all these people would have been expecting us to feed them. We couldn't have brought them in and imported every single thing that we needed to keep this additional 12 to 15 million people fed. So maybe this pandemic was a good exercise in a way so that we have a chance to reflect back. We have more people, more hands out in the fields, and we can restart and move on. There is one other problem that I can see in agriculture, which is very important, and that is the problem of working capital. Most farm households around the country had some kind of income coming from expatriate workers. This was the money they use, the extra money they use to do their cultivation. Now that income may not be there for a while, at least till the petrol prices start going up. We will not have this complementary income, which is very important for our farmers. Now, as we look at the situation in agribusiness, let us also look at what type of a base that we really have in this country, which can ultimately help us to benefit by promoting agribusiness as one of our mainline exports and also one of our mainline products. Sri Lanka itself is a beautiful, compacted agri-economy. We are hit by 2 monsoons and some intermonsoonal rain, which will hit the mountains in the middle of the country and flow down through our rivers. Luckily for us, our kings, ancient kings, have taught us how to harvest this and use it in leaner times. We are not badly situated. We are quite well situated in the very busy shipping lane. And we are just days away from countries like Singapore, maybe 1 day away from the Maldives, the Middle East, where they do not produce that much of food. Then we have bustling cities like Tokyo, even Kuala Lumpur, Mumbai, where high quality agri-produce is greatly appreciated by the high income consumer. %45 of our land is under one type of agriculture or another. Out of this, 16% is covered with our plantation crops, tea, rubber, and coconut. Now, these crops can also be dual cropped or underplanted. So there is much more opportunity because we have heaps of estates and plantations which we can crop again, so that the land use will be much better. 7% of the agriculture land is used as pasture. Now, I know we have, the country talks about being self-sufficient in milk. Now we have to weigh this as against the 7%. Because should we expand our pasture lands, it means that we either have to eat into the other lands which cultivate food for us already, or we have to intrude into our forest cover. %21 of the balance, that is the arable land, 21%, is cultivated by a multitude of small farmers on all parts of the country, from the hill country right down to the low country and the dry zones. We have millions of small farmers who cultivate the balance of the land. Then we have the 30%, which is reserved as forests and reservations and wetlands. And we have 26%, which is now swallowed up by urbanization. So as a small nation, we have an equation to sit down and work out. How much of this land are we using? How much of this land are we leaving back? And what we are using, how efficiently are we going to put it to use? What are the crops we choose? Are we going to start growing everything we want? Or are we going to start growing things that are of value to us? If somebody can produce something at half the price and send it across to us, let's take that and use our land to cultivate something much more valuable and something that can bring in much more income to the country and to its people. We have universal education and healthcare. I know people have many things to say about this, but I think most of this critique is unfair, and it is based on comparison with developed countries where they actually pay for their healthcare. I always tell people, look, we may not value what we have, but I, as a businessman, I can travel anywhere around this country, and if I have a sudden problem, a heart attack or something like that, the closest hospital is only a couple of kilometers away. The closest specialist is around the corner. And also our education. Many times I find myself seated at interviews, and I feel so proud when you meet youth from rural areas and you ask them, okay, what are you doing? My parents are farming. My brother is a doctor. My sister is a teacher. And I have done food science. I'd like to work in your company. I mean, this is fantastic. Many years ago, these kids would have had to come to the cities to work as domestic servants. So our tax money has really done a couple of things, at least we have done correctly. Then the question we should ask ourselves, why can't we do the rest? We are not, saying that I'm not saying that we are the best in the world, but we have good things. And these are things we should be proud of. As a nation, I think also due to tourism and due to our great religions, we have learned to share our land mass with the biodiversity that you see around us. We have huge wildlife and also sea animals that we share our land. So when we talk about the use of our land, we also need to consider this. So if you take the natural rain patterns and the monsoons, most parts of this country, we can have 2 crops. In certain parts, with the harvesting of rain and the movement of water, yes, we can also have a 3rd harvest. So there is no question. It is something that it's low-hanging fruit. We can do this, and we must do this because it's the quickest way we can create wealth. So it's my opinion that agribusiness should be one of the drive topics in this country, where we need to very quickly start up a conversation on how best we can get there, because we cannot let the farmers have a free fall and produce with the current fluctuating prices and things like that. We need to be there as a nation. We have to take a conscious decision and join up to take it where it needs to be. So let us look what is holding us back. Unfortunately, even those bright graduates I was talking about, the young people who have come out of our system, they prefer to stand outside the government offices and say, we haven't got jobs. For some reason, they feel unsure to tackle the private sector. They do not want to be accountable in many ways. They are afraid to take up the challenge. We would need to revisit our education system and see how we can open up their minds. We have very few entrepreneurs who are actually being formed. everybody prefers to go to the government and get a job and a pension and live happily ever after. But we cannot have half our nation doing that and half our nation, the other half, paying their salaries. We have to find a way of weaning them out of this very bad habit. We have so many governing institutions we have to tackle, so that small and medium scale enterprise have to, it's almost impossible to navigate so many institutions to get a job done. I think this is a good opportunity. We saw this problem when the COVID struck us, about getting permits to open factories, to travel from one place to another. For many things, we had to get these things. And it was such a cumbersome job because everything had to be practically attended to. You had to go. You had to line up at the police stations. You had to line up at the PHI's office. You had to find the PHI. One also must realize that most of these institutions were not even prepared for this. They had to fall in line. So I feel it is time for us to take immediate steps to digitize all this activity which can be done. You see, if an entrepreneur, we are quite well connected, if an entrepreneur could get onto his computer and get all these things done, at least most of it that does not need your physical presence, it will save time. They do not have many people to actually go and attend to these things. They mostly 4 or 5 people at a startup. So we need to very seriously consider digitizing most of these services given by the multitude of institutions that cover activity when you're in agribusiness or any business at that. The governance and regulatory systems in the country. I think we do have some of these things. Some are past its prime and need redesigning and relooking, but most of it is there. The problem comes in implementation. You see, the implementation is very poor because of the processes not being there. If all these processes are digitized, and then there's very little for actual people to interact and do things, I'm sure some of these things can be controlled. And the people who are supposed to manage or regulate the systems then can really get down to the important things of what are the standards. In agribusiness, this is very important. If you don't have proper standards, if you don't give that factor of safety to your consumers, then it's almost impossible for us to think that we can export our products to high value markets. We will never be able to compete with the large producers. But definitely out there, there is a niche, which is a huge one, for us to supply high value, high quality product. Then let us look at our tax system. You see, I am a firm believer that by the time we leave our education, we should be willing to leave everything free behind. Because the country has given us a free education, and every single person should be paying his share of the cost. In normal life, if you are running a family, this is what happens. And I feel that if we want to take this nation somewhere, people have to start feeling this responsibility. As long as one part of the country feel that the rich are giving us money to live, which is not the case, which is not the real case. The poor people pay more taxes in comparison to their income. But as long as they feel it's convenient, the rich are paying for us, then nobody is going to work. Nobody is going to look at productivity. Nobody is going to stop waste because we don't feel stakeholders. But if we are even paying 10 rupees as taxes, then we will feel a right to ask for the services, to see that they are properly given, and in the meantime, also to play our role as proper citizens. Then we have the rural farmer base and the farmer organizations. Unfortunately, politics has crept into this organization. So the farmer cooperatives and things like that, there's a huge problem because there is this issue of dependency. You see, if you look at the evening news, half of the news is about people talking about, oh, we did this, we didn't get our fertilizer. We did that, the elephant fence is broken. We did something else, we can't sell our prices. Now, if we have educated our youth, if we have free education for such a long time, if we are connected to the world, if the connectivity to the internet and knowledge is all there, I cannot understand why our farmers are so dependent. I am sure most of us will know this answer, but if this does not stop, again, we will have a problem. We need farmers, strong farmers, educated farmers, the people who they are, really are, to stand up for themselves and, you see, run farm as a business. For instance, sharing of information. You see, we have so many millions of kilos coming in through the economic centers, but there is no data. Nobody can say who is growing what is coming out at what time, what seeds are available, what fertilizer is not available. And every single farmer has a device in his hand which can give him that information. So isn't it time that we do this? You see, you need, the farmers as well as we need to think. You see, myself as a food processor, our company should be in a position to get onto the a site and say, okay, we are looking for so many kilos of whatever. And we should know exactly where it's coming, when it's coming. Then we could go off to our markets and say, look, by this month, we will be able to supply you so many tons of this product. But now it is not the case. It's luck by chance. So what happens? We start importing the deficit. You see, so even in agribusiness, we end up importing. It's not that we can't, obviously we can't produce everything, but we can do much better if we knew very much more what is happening around us. Then there is the defunct cooperative systems, which is now called Sathasa. I want to give you an example. You see, in Sri Lanka, whenever there is a crop of onions, immediately the government runs to protect them and they put a huge duty for imports. If there is something else, again, there is an import. But let's take the case of Japan. The Japanese consumer, wherever you import your products from, the highest prices are paid for Japanese product. There is a cooperative called the Sekatsu Club, where you get magazines, you get programs, where it's all owned by consumers. The whole Sekatsu Club system is owned by the consumers. They support the farmers. You see, if the green tea farmers are having bad prices, Sekatsu Club will send the information through their system to their consumers, and the consumers will bring a program, start up promotions in each of the outlets, and get the prices in. We do not have that kind of participatory movements which make cooperatives effective. You see, we have a cooperative, and then what happens is you get elections in the cooperative, it's politicized, and it never does what it's supposed to do. And what it's supposed to do is to support the small entrepreneur. It's supposed to support the small farmer and help people to market their produce, and at the same time to move products around the country and showcase what they can do. I think few of us know that Sri Lanka was the leading supplier, one of the leading suppliers of shrimps and cut flowers to Japan at one time. But whatever, you see the shrimp farmers started neglecting the environment. They started polluting the water around. We had disease and the whole market collapsed. In the case of the cut flowers, it got politicized. There were people for and against, and ultimately the country suffered. We lost that market. So these are valuable lessons that, you know, we need to handle this as a nation and not as a political party or an ethnic group, religious denomination, or whatever it is. Agribusiness is something that we need to handle with both our hands as a nation and together. So I'm moving on to the next subject that is important if we need to promote agribusiness as one of our exports. And I think for many things, we need to create a sustainable destination brand. Usually destination brands have to be very comparative in nature, so that, you know, people have to sit down, and this exercise is something that the whole nation has to think and show, what do we have that other people don't have? What could we harvest best? What could we do at the best prices? What can bring us the most value? So building this comparative nature into our brands, and also as a destination. Because you see, if you take the example of a particular product, let's say a sauce, made in Sri Lanka, made in Singapore, and made in Hong Kong. Hong Kong and Singapore don't produce, but they get a higher price because they have a destination brand. You see, if you look at their culinary practices, the standard of living, the expectations of the people, overall, they give that value. So the destination brand is very important for everybody. Each and every one of us who are exporting, this would be a platform which is created. If this platform is not created in a sustainable manner, and if all the stakeholders, internal and external, have a proper affiliation to this brand, then this exercise will be of no use. We need to feel as one nation. We need to feel proud about branding. And it has a long-term consequence. That is why I say, let's culture a brand. You know, it should be a lifestyle. It should become a lifestyle in Sri Lanka. We should not tolerate anything more than the level that the standard that we set. You know, nobody should be going below the standards that are set. This is something that has to come within. Maybe it does not happen in a few days and months, but it definitely can be created over a time. We have, you know, let's take our majority religion, Buddhism. You see, Buddhism is a religion where the bringing of food is such a spiritual and important practice. This in itself gives us a comparative edge. I'm remembered in Japan, they use this term a lot when they want to explain the quality of a product or what has gone into produce a product. It says kokuro wo komite, which means with all my heart and soul. And if we are to create a sustainable and good destination brand for our country, that's what everybody should be feeling. This brand captures all my heart and soul. If I do something, it will be like that. So I'd like to take an example of something that had happened. If we go back to 97, when Sri Lankan Airlines was created, they started off with this slogan, "A taste of paradise." And I, at that time, thought this was fantastic, because we Sri Lankans were known at that time around the world for our wonderful cup of tea, which makes millions of people smile when they take it because it's so good. So this transcended more beyond just our airline. It went into the essence of the country. It could stand up for our tea. It could stand up for our coconut. It could stand up for our spices, cut flowers, fruits, vegetables, fisheries. You see, the exotic nature of what we can do in this beautiful country is unlimited. And to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have this chance after the COVID to once again offer the world a taste of paradise where they would smile and we would give them a reason to smile in this difficult world, while all of us, right back to the rural areas, can also smile by the value we create. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario, for that important and thoughtful deliberation. So I pick up some points. Are we ready to face the different era? And you have mentioned the people will turn into agriculture even with difficulties, so the supply base will be there. And of course, yes, we love to hear this agribusiness as a mainline exports, yes. And also some of the challenges that you have mentioned, the issue with the supply data, and of course that we don't have any powerful consumer organizations like in Japan, that what you have mentioned, and the danger of politicization. Also the very important point that what we have mentioned, I think it is the raising the standards of the country or the consumers, so that we can achieve some of the expectations from the standardization expectations and the kind of the destination branding. So all in all, it's really interesting. And before going into the questions which are coming from or which came from the participants, I would like to clarify a couple of points from you. The one thing is as an EDB, we would like to see that we need to clarify, or we need to project that how do you position Sri Lanka in the global market with the comparative advantage also we have, because you're talking about the destination branding and the agripreneurship, so that can you give your thoughts on on this jigsaw puzzle of global market in agriculture? How the Sri Lanka can position itself, according to your thoughts, Mario?
Well, I can give 2 points that affect us a lot. One thing is immediately we use any material from Sri Lanka when we are exporting. One of the things we can say is we do not use any genetically modified material. We can very clearly say that because the country does not allow such seeds to be imported. We only use hybrids and the natural seeds. On the other hand, we also don't use irradiation, which is done in most of the countries, even India, which is next to us. In Sri Lanka, we do not have this process. I know some people may not agree because they feel that bulk exports needs to have irradiation and that will help us to raise our standards and things like that. But not having that also tells something about it, that we naturally control the produce we harvest. Also, the other thing of traceability. Being a small country, and most of our exporters, I'm sure you are also aware, we have a backward integration running, especially in the spice sector, also in the coconut sector. So we can assure our consumers that we can trace back to where the raw material is coming from, how those lands have been tended. You see, also the consumers around the world today, they like to feel when they pay some money that they have paid beyond that product. That when they pay something for a product, that has also benefited a whole supply chain, the people within that, and also protected the environment, so that these things have come in a sustainable manner. So such things we can do in Sri Lanka. I mean, currently we are having this problem of people saying no fertilizer, no fertilizer. I am not a scientist. I am a simple entrepreneur. But maybe if we can get together and find a way of using less harmful chemical fertilizer, which can be created from the mountains of rubbish that we throw away from our urban areas into cultivation, maybe we can create this agribusiness brand, which is very comparative to other countries.
Okay, thank you about it. And I have another question on now. You have also mentioned about the people will turn into agriculture even with difficulties, and they go back to agriculture, or they go to wherever the land they have or whatever. But then again, there's a controversy because the I would say it is may not only be in Sri Lanka, but still the young people, whether they have the passion for agriculture. So when we are talking about the agripreneurship, so now I have read a little bit on the average age of a farmer is even in most of the countries in this part of the world, much older people are farmers, not the youngsters. So youngsters are really not attracted into this agricultural field. I would like to ask you whether you accept that or whether you deny it, or if you accept it, how do you look at it? What will be the kind of your opinion?
So as I said, by default, due to the times, we are having the young people going back. So that may be not their choice, but they are going back home. And due to the uncertainty around, they probably would stay there for a while longer. Now, the question I would ask is, if you look at what a middle class youngster is doing with his time, you see, and a farmer's young son, You see, they also want to come to the free trade zone, do a job, and in the evening they need to socialize and things like that. But if they are at home, they work from morning till night, and nothing comes out of it. So the answer to this is technology. Even today, what are we doing? We are giving people fertilizer. So like the Chinese saying, why are we giving them fish? Let's give them a fishing rod. If we fix solar panels and we use technology to control, we have polytunnels and other things so that you can get a year-long cultivation. And farming is not a difficult profession. It becomes a fashionable profession. I believe youngsters will go back. But if it's not, I also know, because during my time in the National Agribusiness Council, I know young farmers who drive their Toyota station wagon to the field in Putlam, growing chilies. So even in this country, there are successful people. Unfortunately, the rest of the young people don't know about this. But that possibility is there. So I think it's as, you see, we all need to get together and also solve that question. Why should I go back to my father's field? It is not fashionable. It is not a good lifestyle. And I don't make enough money. And all three of these, as consumers, as citizens, we are in a position to solve this or give those answers.
Okay, it's inspiring answer. Thank you for that. And then I turn to a little bit of questions. Questions we got from the participants. There are around 4 questions from Anuradha Jayasinghe. So I would like to put it in a nutshell. He's talking about a couple of things, but now he's asking about the research and development in agriculture. Now I would put the question in this manner. So the R&D, for R&D, do you think the government will have to spend on R&D, or the government should have a budget, or the agripreneurship or the agripreneurs are doing it already, or it is a lacking thing in Sri Lanka? Is connected to the participant's question. Yeah.
You see, if you look at not limiting to agribusiness, but look at all the successful research and development that happens. It starts off at a different end. In Sri Lanka, we have this thing of, institutes trying to do the research and development. Government funds are sent through so that companies tie up with them and do. But mostly the very successful, let's take even in technology, what happens is there are young people who want to solve a problem in the world. That is the reasoning. And then from there, the research and development starts taking place, because you are going to solve a problem in the world. You find your niche. This is a problem. I'm going to find it. And then you start researching. Sometimes you don't, this thing. I'd like to tell you a story. When I first started business, I had never had anything to do with food. Actually, my work up to then had been in the ceramic industry. So when I suddenly found myself in Dambulla and with all these produce around, and I thought, I need to know about this thing. And I walked into CISIR. At that time, Professor Jayans was the director. He sat me and had a chat with me, and he said, okay, I'd like to help you, but there is one problem. The government has told me that I need to earn some money. I can't give this free. So I said, okay, doctor, what does it mean? Now I got afraid because I didn't have too much of money in my pockets. Then he said, no, what you have, you offer me. And the next 6 months, you can come here and start learning what we know. You see, so that was 15,000 rupees at that time. I said, yes, it still hurt, but I thought I learned a hell of a lot and walked off. So I think, you see, we need to be able to do that. There should be people. It doesn't take a lot of money. That's what I'm trying to say. You see, if you know your problem, there are always institutes, there are always companies And you see, we Sri Lankans still have this habit of either the government or borrow from the bank. We don't know how to raise capital for whatever activity we want to do. So if you are really solving a problem, I am sure there are other people who may have more resources than you who are also interested in that problem. Then automatically the investment will come in.
Yeah, thanks, Mario. Do you think the kind of the science and technology in science and technology is sufficiently engaged with the agricultural field in Sri Lanka, or you think that because why I am asking this is also to in connection with the participants' questions, but I would add to that because we have a vibrant IT industry in Sri Lanka. We know that this IT industry is supplying into, most of the sophisticated markets in the world. So they have some kind of sophisticated technologies they deal with. And I know we all know that there are very lucrative investments are here also from from operating in Sri Lanka. So this kind of technology, are you satisfied this technology-wise the agriculture sector is really taking the advantage of the technology available in the country is being used by the agriculture sector?
I don't think there is you see the proper data is available. The technology may be available, and I'm not sure that people have realized the value in bringing in those systems. Because when you have around 3.5 to 4 million users, you see, even if you charge 25 cents per shot, you can just imagine what you can earn. So there just needs to be some people who are willing to drive it. I'm sure there are smart guys who are coming from farmer families, you see, who are also IT specialists. They look, there is that open chance available. Somebody needs to take it up, and we are dinosaurs, old guys, and not very, but there are the younger generation who can definitely do that.
Okay, Mario, I think we are coming into the kind of time is exhausting, but I will, there's another question regarding the land utilization of Sri Lanka. This is also from the participants. How do you look at it? I think we have touched upon this one. In the countries like this part of the world, maybe we have always small plots of lands and not big, huge lands, and the people are trying to have their cultivation in comparatively smaller spots like that, and then the land utilization. How do you look at this in Sri Lanka as far as the exports angle?
Yeah, I believe the utilization is not efficient. There's very much more we can do with the land we have.
Any advice or any advice kind of thing you can come up with?
First and foremost, you see the excess labor and the large estate sector. This is something that can start happening there. If they are open for, leasing out certain plots of land where smaller entrepreneurs can work with the excess labor available on the fields, or even the labor themselves. If it's at an affordable level where they are, we always have this tug of war on, the wages for estate labor. And most estate labor finish their work by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So there is more time. If the estate, and most of them actually do some productive cultivation. but it is done informally. If that can be formalized and the estate says, okay, let's share the harvest and this thing, then they can utilize their land properly and also at the same time do it. In other places also, the utilization of land is very poor. So for that reason, I think we should go for protected agriculture. There's a lot of highlands which are not utilized. And now simple polytunnel costs less than $1,000. $600 you can get a fairly reasonable and functional polytunnel. So maybe, you see, we should start thinking as a country, are we giving people fertilizer or are we giving permanent fixtures? Are we investing in infrastructure so that they can cultivate more, get higher prices? And also we need to cultivate higher priced products. I know recently there was a ban on turmeric, for instance. Now, there was the feeling that we could produce all the turmeric we want in the country. But I think that's not the case. And turmeric is a longer crop. It takes 4 to 5 months to be harvested. So which means that you are going beyond the cultivation season also. So we have to have a look at it and see, okay, can we grow something more productive on those lands? While India will produce it for a ton less than $1,000. So why not we utilize it in a higher value?
Yeah. Maybe we have some kind of verticals and our quality may be better and things like that. Yeah. There are a couple of questions raised, but I will end with this question. The Tusit Vijay Singh is asking, is Sri Lanka experiencing around 40% post-harvest losses? How do you address this issue?
I don't know if this 40% is right or wrong, because again, there is no data, but there is a loss. This is something that I have been trying to push from the day the economic center in Dambulla started, and that is for rail transport. You see, we had thousands of lorries packed to the brim, moving vegetables in and out in very humid and hot condition, whereas you can have simple aerated containers transporting direct from Dambulla into the Colombo Manning Market, fresher vegetables, because actually the spoilage, if you look at how it is getting spoiled, if you take the old Manning Market, and if you had tested the atmosphere there would be a heavier bacterial load than anywhere else in Colombo, in that place. It was in such a bad condition. So the decaying of vegetables gets faster after going to that center. Thankfully, we have a new place. So I don't think it is, automatically if we lift our standards, the farmers will also start understanding how to pack. They will have their own collective pack houses through cooperative systems and all that. But there is a loss. I cannot vouch because I'm not a scientist, or I don't carry the data that it's 40%, but it is a loss which can be avoided.
Okay, I think we have come to the end of the session. Yeah, Mr. Mario de Alvis, it is an insightful and thoughtful session. I think there are a lot of things to carry on from here. And thank you for that. And all the participants will end the session here. Yeah, we went beyond 10 minutes. I think it is important 10 minutes that with some thoughts and the insightful messages. So we'll end from here and stay safe. We'll meet again. So bye for now.
Thank you, Saman, and good luck to everybody. Stay safe.